First of all, thank you all for traveling to Chicago. Most of you came from out of town, and it's with weather being completely unpredictable. That was a brave thing to do. So, but looks like things are cooperating for the moment. At any rate, we're starting off with a celebration. We're here to celebrate a number of things. One is the 10-year anniversary of the Technical Reports Archive and Information project, TRAIL. TRAIL is a project that digitizes primarily engineering technical reports, federal government produced technical reports, like this one here from the Atomic Energy Commission from the 1950s. TRAIL is one of the groups that works under the CRL umbrella. TRAIL was founded by librarians from a number of Western universities. The University of Arizona, Malika Oxnam was the first director, the founding director, I guess, of the TRAIL project. And since then, Mel Desart from University of Washington, and now Patricia Kirkwood from University of Arkansas is now director of the program. TRAIL represents the efforts of some very, very enthusiastic, very, very energetic engineering librarians from a number of institutions. Those librarians, what CRL does is provides TRAIL essentially a home. We do financial management for them. We provide them communication space and capabilities, that kind of thing. The people I know from the activity in our online communication space that the TRAIL people never sleep. I'll check the space at 8 o'clock in the morning, and there will have been 2 people from TRAIL that have been in the space during the course of the night. So this is a tremendous project. TRAIL is actually one of the 25 top contributors to HathiTrust Digital Library now. They've digitized over 53,000 reports and 39,000 volumes, and so annually they're one of the top contributors to HathiTrust. So we congratulate them. They were founded, as I said, by a number of Western institutions and under the auspices of the Greater Western Library Alliance. But a few years ago, they moved to CRL. We were able to help them broaden their membership. And now there are libraries throughout the U.S. that are members of TRAIL, so it's a particularly successful project. Why I'm talking about it is because they are one of several communities of interest that operate under the CRL umbrella. TRAIL is a particularly energetic group, but there are other groups that have been working since the 1960s, many of them, in identifying important endangered materials such as Afghan publications from Afghanistan during the difficult years, the Soviet years, and the years of the various recent Afghan wars, collecting documentation, collecting ephemera and publications. Two of the groups working under the CRL umbrella raised money recently and undertook the microfilming of this pretty remarkable collection of material that's by definition endangered material. And other groups like the Latin Americanist group, the two groups under the CRL umbrella that contributed to that was the South Asian Materials Project and the Middle East Materials Project. Again, those projects consist of really some of the premier area studies people at some of the largest and big research libraries in the U.S. Also, the Latin Americanist group did a project this past year. I'm just mentioning a couple things that happened very recently. The Latin Americanists have also been active in this case, in bringing together a collection of newspapers from Ciudad Juarez, which is in northern Mexico and is a part of Mexico, if you read the newspapers, that has seen years and years of violence, mostly drug-related killings, that kind of thing. El Diario, the newspaper published there, is one of the core records or the key records of this period of turbulence in Mexico. That was materials, the newspapers itself was, the copies of the newspapers was contributed by New Mexico State, University, and they'll be archived at University of Texas at Austin. But under the CRL umbrella, the Latin American Materials Project funded the microfilming of that newspaper. These groups are growing and thriving. CRL has been contributing money to their programs to help them digitize more materials. These have all been focused, not so much the Trail Project, but the rest of them have all been focused on preserving materials and using microfilm as reformatting. They've now, only in the past 5 or 6 years, embraced digitization as a form of reformatting for access. And so we're encouraging that by providing a little bit of money every year to help them do that. And so they're doing terrific things. This year, the South Asian project, the South Asian Materials Project, succeeded in launching a new initiative, which will be an open archives digitization project, which will digitize primary source materials, newspapers, government documents, reports, political ephemera, and that kind of thing, mostly from the Indian subcontinent, from South Asian region. The South Asian Open Archives project, founded or led by James Nye at University of Chicago, not only launched, but were able to raise about $500,000 in commitments from member libraries to digitize this material. So this is going to help unlock a lot of material that has been collected and preserved over the years by your institutions working with these groups under the auspices of CRL, that's been held at CRL and is delivered by CRL, but it'll unlock them, enable them to be used worldwide, if not CRL membership wide. So these are terrific things. Those are some of the outputs. I want to talk a little bit about the use of collections. The loans from collections, the number of requests we get for loans, as it is in many institutions, is declining. I think probably the best years were in the 1990s, early 2000s, but there's been a pretty steady decline in that. But the number of items that we've been lending has been growing. So there is still very vigorous use of the collections by a number of institutions. The top ones in all categories are the ones you would expect: Harvard, Michigan, Notre Dame, University of Chicago, University of Minnesota. Those are the institutions that are borrowing the most materials, that are getting most document delivery and that kind of thing. But in terms of items borrowed, it's the same group. The order is shuffled a little bit, but Harvard being the top one. So it's really, when I look at these names, I always think, well, this is the Nobel list or the Nobel Prize short list. And I think, well, maybe that has something to do with the fact that they're members of CRL. I think there is a pattern that's emerged over the years that would lead you to believe that, though. But top users of digital. These are just the numbers here are the pages scanned for them this year. And so these are the first 3 quarters of this fiscal year since July 1st. So Texas A&M is pretty far ahead of everybody. We scanned 76,000 pages on demand for them. The scanning is done in response to a request for the loan of materials. In many cases, somebody will want to borrow something that's too fragile to send. In that case, we'll scan it. In some cases, they'll want to borrow something that's just a single item that we don't want to risk sending out anyway, even if it's not fragile. It may be rare or unique, and a lot of the CRL materials are. So we'll scan that. And so these numbers all came from that part of the operation. These are people at CRL who will respond to these interlibrary loan requests by digitizing material, posting it on the web for the user to use. The good thing about it is that once those things are posted, they're accessible to researchers at all the schools, all the institutions. And so we've been building up over time a corpus of materials through scanning on request that has now it's a little bit above 7 million pages right now. And it's not Google Books, but most of it is not, you're not going to find in Google. In fact, we're very careful not to scan anything that's available through HathiTrust. If we have we have a fairly large monograph collection, and many times, not all the time, but many times, if somebody wants to borrow a monograph, we decide to scan it. Before we scan it, we'll check HathiTrust and see if it's available easily through HathiTrust. So we avoid doing that for obvious reasons I'll talk about a little bit later. But so we have built up this corpus, and that's growing. In fact, it's accelerating. We've been scanning more in the last 2 years than we were doing in the years before that, because of the investment in digital that the chair, Scott Waugh, talked about. Penn State, 20,777 pages. University of Hong Kong, one of our global members, about 17,200 pages, just that, and that was just one request. so needless to say, we don't turn these around in a day in every case, but most things we do. Max Planck Institute, a brand new member of CRL, one of our new members in Max Planck Institute in Berlin. We scanned about 10,657 pages for them. What are they looking at? It's interesting to look at the trends, the kinds of things that people are using. Both University of Hong Kong and Max Planck Institute are looking at a lot of material from South Asia, from in particular, some of the more turbulent parts of South Asia. There's a lot of mining of the literature of the jihad. There's a lot of mining of the literature of civil society in Pakistan, in India, and other parts of South Asia and Middle East, Afghanistan, that kind of thing. A lot of these materials were materials that CRL acquired through the Library of Congress PL 480 project, but you can't get them from the Library of Congress. I mean, they're basically those collections they don't lend. But so these things are getting out there. It's interesting that a lot of this material that relates to law, civil society, the courts, and to religion and to organized religion in these parts of the world is getting more attention. And I think that will continue given the interest or given what's happening in the political sphere. Surging members. Yeah, we have a lot of members like Harvard that use a lot of materials every year, but there are, if you can apply the word surging to research activity, to the activity of research, these are institutions that have been borrowing more or getting more materials from CRL, and just within the last year. You notice they're all fairly big ones, except Macalester College. It's a four-year liberal arts college, and that's because just much more primary source research is being done by students at these places here. Also, these places like Macalester College have access to a much higher caliber of faculty than they did 10 or 15 years ago. And so that research activity is something that we're fueling. It's interesting, they see the kinds of work that's being done. The arrangement with Linda Hall Library, where CRL libraries get free document delivery from Linda Hall serial collections. Some of the biggest users of that are St. Olaf College and Carleton College in Minnesota. And I'm not sure, University of Minnesota is also a big user. And so I'm not sure whether it's the culture of Minnesota that promotes deep research or deep original research, or whether it's something else. We'll find out after the election. So we've been, aside from responding to services or responding to requests from faculty. The good thing about digitizing on demand is that the material is going to get used. If somebody asks for it, it's going to get used. So it's not speculative. It's not just in case kind of activity. We do a fair amount of strategic digitization, though, as well. We have been digitizing under a project funded by the Carnegie Corporation some of the more endangered government-produced publications that exist on the planet. This is a project, you're looking at the Gazette from 1960-something, from Sudan. This is part of a project that was funded by the Carnegie Corporation, and this grew out of, to a certain extent, that Leviathan Forum we had a couple of years ago, where I think a number of you were here for that. That was about government information, and particularly about born digital government information. But what we realized and what we learned at that forum was that there's so much government publication, there's so many government publications, and the governments are putting out so much data and so much content now, so much documentation, that we really have to triage if we're going to be able to deal with it. And we're really going to have to decide what's the most important material. And we found that our reasoning is that the most important materials are materials that most likely to disappear. And material that's very likely to disappear are government publications in countries where the regime is corrupt or oppressive. When these are things that are likely, even though they were published by the governments originally, these are things that are likely to get repressed by either the next regime that comes in, or they become documentation that's incriminating, and then the same government that published them pulls them back. And we're seeing a lot of pulling back of government materials, archives particularly now. After years of freedom of information and open government, we are seeing a fair amount of retrenching or scaling back of access to a lot of these kinds of things. So we looked at Transparency International's index of corruption and identified some of the most corrupt countries in the world. And according to Transparency International, we had our opinions about which countries were corrupt, but we went with the benchmark. And we proposed the Carnegie Corporation that, well, the CRL led an effort several years ago, working with the New York Public Library and the Library of Congress, to create a comprehensive collection of government gazettes. And in that collection, which is at CRL, are publications from some of those most corrupt countries in the world. These countries like Sudan, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Algeria, Republic of Congo, that kind of thing. So we're just finishing up a digitization project this year using the Carnegie funds that will get all these out on the web. They will be open access because that's part of the terms of our funding. And we also thought it'd be nice if the people in those countries had access to them as well, without having to join CRL, of course. So those, that's getting done. We've also been contributing, or some of the groups working under the CRL umbrella, like the Latin American Materials Project, to also contribute to projects where materials are being digitized out there in member libraries. One in particular is the Latin American and Caribbean political pamphlet collection at Princeton University libraries, and that there's some funding that went from the LAMP project to Princeton this year to help with that. That's something that Princeton has been doing on its own for years. Very, very important collection of Latin American materials collected by Princeton over the years by some very enlightened bibliographers working at Princeton, and that's now being coming onto the web. And I think David Mager from Princeton is here today. He's one of the driving forces behind it, yeah. So, all right, so digitization, strategic digitization, we're trying to be careful about we digitize. We are spending money, but we're spending money prudently to do that. Another area where we've been working, and this is something that CRL only got into a few years ago, is the area of licensing of databases. And we have some fairly good results. Just for the first 3 quarters of this fiscal year, we offered 54 different databases, and versus the 30 that we had done by the end of this quarter, or by the third quarter in fiscal last year. So that's starting to grow. 317 of those, or 317 databases were purchased. There were 317 purchases through CRL. These are terms that we negotiated with. These are through terms we negotiated with the vendors, versus we had only done about 157 this time last year. And this year, 117 CRL libraries benefited from this. So they took, they took part in acquiring databases or subscribing to databases through CRL, and that's up again from last year as well. So this is starting to get some traction, starting to grow some more. It's been very popular. I think the results have been good. Some of the money on it was the savings, averaging it over this quarter is about, per database, a library would save anywhere from $177 to about $73,000. And that is, of course, the publishers, comparing it to the publisher's list price, which is kind of a fiction in itself. But at any rate, it's the benchmark we have to go on. The average savings a library, one of the CRL libraries, got out of it was about $22,000. And that's just this year so far. The highest single library savings was Purdue University, and that was the difference between what they paid for the database and so what the list prices were, was $374,000. So that was those are numbers that we use to measure how well this is working or not. So we got into licensing, really not to be a buying club. I mean, CRL was late getting into the licensing world, and we had no intention of just becoming a buying club, just trying to get the best price for things, which is certainly important. But what we were after was getting since we are a big organization, 200 and some members, U.S. and Canadian members, we thought there was some potential for getting some leverage with the vendors and with the publishers. And on a lot of things, on price, yeah, but also on things like the right to text mine, the integrity of the database, knowing what's actually in the database before you buy it, that kind of thing, pushing back on that. We've made some progress. We've gotten some of the larger publishers like Gale and Economist to disclose more information about what's actually in these databases than they would have normally. In many cases, these things, particularly the purchase databases, are advertised before they're created. And so pushing back at when publishers start selling things to your faculty, we thought was in order. So Aegis Iterata is a platform that we're using to coordinate and centralize this activity. And so Aegis Iterata is a platform, has reviews or critical evaluations of databases and electronic resources. It also has a profile, increasingly profiles of the providers, so what we know about the publishers of these things. There's a fair amount of information on our profile of Gale about the Gale or this engaged bankruptcy a couple of years ago. There's the genealogy of some companies like ProQuest, those kinds of things. The whole purpose of this is to get to help make the decisions that you make, that people at your institutions make, about purchasing or subscription to databases more informed, so that you have more data, more information about these things to base your decisions on, and so that you can do better in licensing things that you don't even license through CRL. So right now we have about 335 different databases that are reviewed on there, or at least listed. Some of the reviews are pretty skimpy, but others are pretty deep. And we find that we've now are getting reactions or results from the publishers from our pushing back to them. I think they've begun to feel that there's some community of opinion and community of interest among the research institutes, research universities, and the academic libraries in the U.S. and Canada that wasn't there before. So that's worked well. We are going to do more. As I said, licensing was something we just started a few years ago. We are feeling now that, the niche for CRL, the niche that we pursued was the big data databases, the big news databases, the big financial databases, the big census and population and demographic databases, those kinds of things, the big geospatial databases. This is the kind of thing, these are the kind of things where the consortia that are working now, a lot of them are just not engaged in. This is a different type of animal as a publisher or as a vendor that we're dealing with here. These are publishers whose market is largely not the academic libraries community. Their market are largely the financial community or the the public policy market, the public policy community, and industry and that kind of thing. And so it's tougher to get leverage with them. They don't structure their deals the way the traditional academic database companies do, like Adam Matthew and those kinds of things. These are organizations like the New York Times, like Bloomberg, like Economist Intelligence Unit, the Economist Group, like Digital Globe, the foremost purveyor of satellite imagery in the world now. And these are organizations whose content and whose data is critical to scholarship, is being used by faculty doing original advanced research at your institutions. And so these are things that are of consequence, and we really don't have we've really not gotten great leverage. We've not really gotten traction on collective dealings with these organizations for the most part. We're making some progress. We have CRL's negotiated an academic site license for the New York Times and for the Financial Times and for a number of other things. And we're working with NERL, the Northeast Research Libraries Consortium, which is based at CRL now, to compare strategies and to kind of synchronize our whining to the publishers at least. But this is an area where we have to make progress. We really have got to do better. And we are hunkered down trying to do better at CRL. One of the problems with these is that a lot of these publishers are, aside from the fact that academia is not a big market for them, they're selling to academia not through the libraries. The Digital Globe is dealing with, and Esri, the big geospatial platform providers, dealing with your geography department or your environmental science department, those kinds of things. The New York Times, we have found, is now going to Student Government Association, Dean of Arts and Sciences, the Provost's office to sell the academic site license for the New York Times. I think it would be a really bad thing if libraries were not in this supply chain. We're not part of the negotiations for access to these resources, because libraries have a role to play. The Student Government Association doesn't care if the New York Times historical content is accurate or it has any integrity to it. Basically, they're keeping the youngsters happy. But our scholars are going to need those URLs to be persistent for the long term. They're going to need the content that's published there to stay there for the long term. And there are real issues with that. A lot of a certain amount of New York Times content, for instance, and a certain amount of every news organization online service, whether it's New York Times or Guardian, a certain amount of that content is licensed by the New York Times, bought from others. Some of those licenses are very short term. So if there's material that's on their website today, there's no guarantee it's going to be on it tomorrow. And so I think it's really important that we get some leverage with these kinds of organizations. And so we're working hard to do that. It's difficult, but I think these are very, very big issues, and they are going to erode libraries' presence in the academic community, I think, if we're not involved in the negotiations for these. So we have, I promised on the agenda that we would have, we talk about three big questions, or we would pose three big questions. So question number one. Okay, what we're doing, another part of our licensing program is to get more information out there about the things we're paying for. And one of the big things that we're paying for, a lot of our libraries are paying for, is digital preservation through organizations like Portico and CLOCS and then the LOCS programs. Just about 2 years ago, Portico announced that they created a new program called the D Collections. And they were taking in content from some of the database vendors that sell to us, namely Gale Adam Matthew, and more recently EBSCO. And so now this database content, the historical databases, the historical newspaper databases, historical documents databases, were going to be beginning to be archived in Portico. It sounded good, but there were certain kind of things that didn't kind of make sense to us. I mean, we thought, well, Portico's an archive for ebooks and articles from e-journals, so how are they going to handle things like digitized newspapers or digitized material from the British Library or from the British Public Records Office, that kind of thing? There's a whole different kind of material, whole different kinds of platforms that these materials are served on. The kind of platform that you get Gale's 19th century British newspapers on is not the same as you get JSTOR on. And so how is Portico going to make that available, when that material available when the time comes to light it up? So we thought it'd be good to have a conversation with Portico, because we think, you know, we did an audit of Portico a few years ago, and we were very impressed with what they did, but this was a whole new ballgame. So we did convene 2 conference calls with Portico, with Kate Wittenberg from Portico and her leadership team, to where people from your libraries got to quiz them and ask them questions. In fact, some very hard questions about how this material is going to get served when you know, if Portico has to light it up, that kind of thing. What kind of costs would be involved further down the line, that kind of thing. And so that was very useful. So it's part of our program. Again, it's our licensing program is all about making decisions that people at your institutions have to make all the time, a little bit more informed, giving you more data for it. So back to the question, is our digital investment paying off? We're doing digitization. I talked about that. We're doing, and the corpus is slowly, very slowly getting digitized, but we've been able to put a fair amount out there. The licensing program is starting to get some traction, although it's not moving as fast as I'd like it to move. It's not moving as fast as it needs to move. We haven't scaled up, but it's, I think it's doing important things. Our collection analysis is getting to be more useful to libraries. This past year we did analysis of a number of shared print collections, Scholars Trust holdings, CIC holdings, and University of California shared print holdings. And so doing our analysis of that was done because of capabilities we built up at CRL over the years, thanks to some support from the Mellon Foundation and from Institute of Museum and Library Services and ICON, International Coalition on Newspapers. These are helpful. I think they've been useful. We've shown, you know, we've captured the benchmark, and it is happening slowly. We do think, though, that the amount of content that we've digitized is really small in comparison to what's out there. I mean, obviously it pales in comparison to Google Books. Obviously it pales even in comparison to the public domain content that's available through HathiTrust. But it tends to be more unique, it tends to be more specialized, that kind of thing. So we do think it's paying off. What we feel is very important, though, is to make sure we're not spending money that we don't have to spend, that we're not spending money twice. A number of CRO libraries are also members of HathiTrust digital libraries, so you're paying money every year to support HathiTrust. For that reason, we do not digitize anything that's in HathiTrust. We're now moving beyond that to discussions with HathiTrust, strategic discussions about where the development of HathiTrust content is going, in relation to where the development of CRL content is going, digital content is going. And I think those are very important discussions. And if you're active with HathiTrust, I think that's something you'll encourage. Mike Furlow is going to be talking this afternoon, in fact. The executive director of HathiTrust will be talking this afternoon about strategic alignment of CRL and HathiTrust future digitization. So we think there's some prospects for making the two programs together serve making a much bigger bang than they've made. But I think, I mean, that's my sense of this. I do think it's the digital investment has been worthwhile. Should more CRL digital resources be open access? I know there's a lot of feeling in the community that material that's digitized in libraries should be made openly accessible. We have the, well, we're in a situation, though, where you're financing our digitization. So does it make sense to, oops, wait a minute. I think I have a slide out of place here. Let me get this. Oh no, this is where I talk about the money. Yep. All right. This I told Shimo I would take Shimo Rang, our treasurer, that I would take this on because this will come up in the treasurer's report as well. What do we mean by our digital investment? Well, as the chair Scott Waugh said earlier, we have been drawing on our reserve funds for the last couple of years, last 2 years, to finance and support the digitization. These are reserve funds that have been built up over the course of about 5 or 6 years of surplus budgets. We felt a couple of years ago, and this was decided by the board, that we would be better off investing that money in benefits for the membership than just sitting on it and letting it earn money or not earn money in the stock market. So we decided that we would draw on the investment systematically over the course of several years to support increase accelerated digitization of collections, building up our licensing program, building up our collection analysis capabilities, and that's what we've done. You'll see that the fiscal year 2017 budget, the proposed budget, you'll get to hear about in a few minutes from the treasurer. That brings us that we're projecting a deficit of $858,000. That means in that year spending that much more than what we actually bring in the year. So that requires us to draw on the reserve. The next 2 years, we're going to be moving that figure. We're going to be dropping that figure. We can't keep drawing on the reserve because that'll disappear. So we have to start working our way back to a balanced budget in the next couple of years. So we are projecting to do that. This assumes that this is the scenario that we sketched out, assuming that the membership stays at its current level. So with the membership at its current level, there's an inflationary factors built in there based on the growth of people's library materials expenditures, which is what your cost share is based on. It's been averaging about 3% a year. A lot of libraries actually are paying less this year, will pay less next year than they paid this year. A lot of libraries paid less this year than they paid last year because the cost share is based on your library materials expenditures, and when they go down, the cost share goes down. But assuming everything is the same and that we don't grow the membership dramatically, this will give us a small increase in revenue over the course of several years. That does get us back to a better situation starting in fiscal year 2020. And at that point, then we'll start growing the reserves again, and growing the reserves and investing the money, but in operations and services. But that's the way it works. So when we're talking about investing in digital, this is what we're talking about. Any questions so far? David.
So in terms of investing in digital, do you think there's a... Thank you. In terms of investing in digital, do you think there's a balance point where investing in improving the discoverability of what's digitized might overall improve its value to the users by obviously the use would go up if it was more exposed?
Yes, yeah, and in fact that's one area where we know we have to do work because it's what we digitize is not getting the use that we really just kind of intuitively think it should get. So the use has been growing, but discoverability I think would be a good investment. Because you spend a certain amount of money and then you get much better, much greater returns. We have Amy Wood, who handed you the microphone, is head of technical services at CRL and has been working hard with OCLC on the increasing discoverability of CRL records using the OCLC discovery system. That is not as obvious. I mean, the way that works is not as obvious as OCLC would have you think. It is this. Sometimes these things are more obscurity layers than discovery layers, and so there are complications on that. But we now have a couple of recorded webinars that Amy gave that are on our website that I recommend your people in your technical services to look into, to see where we are and how what we've been able to do and what is required of people in the library itself in terms of making the CRL records more discoverable, because it's been a problem. I mean, we wound up having when discovery layers got put in, less discovery of electronic resources that we have, or catalog resources that we've had. But Amy and her people have been putting a lot of time and energy into working with the OCLC, and then also working with like the California Digital Library to make the catalog records more discoverable there, and University of California, that kind of thing. But yeah, good point. Okay, so question number 2, should more digital resources be open access? So when we spend on digitization, when we spend your money, we have to decide whether the materials that we're going to make available electronically should be open to everybody or not. And when we spend grant money, we don't have any choice. When we spend grant money to digitize materials, those materials have to be available to everybody. What you get with open access, though, is a fair amount of free riding, and we do have a free riding problem. We have a free riding problem because we have 219 members, and we should have about 700 members, because there are about 700 libraries in the US and Canada that have the same profiles as your institutions. And those institutions are not are benefiting by CRL resources when we digitize something to be open access. Scholars at those institutions are benefiting. So we have to deal with that problem. For the most part, when we digitize materials using grant funds, we make them available. They're openly accessible. For the most part, when we digitize materials using CRL funds, they're available only through IP address authentication to researchers at your institution, students and researchers at your institution. In some cases, in many cases, the materials that we digitize are not clearly in the public domain, and those materials we have to limit the use of. We can't make them open access because that would be clear violation of copyright. Well, we do make them available to researchers in your domains and through IP address authentication. So that's the way we do this. Now, we had a discussion about this a couple weeks ago with the Collections and Services Policy Committee, which is the committee chaired by Martha Ruska, these are the deciders at CRL about what we do and what we collect. And it was a good discussion. I think the sense of the group, and Martha, correct me if this is wrong, was that we are taking the right approach, basically, to digitization, or to creating what we call community access, as opposed to open access for certain kinds of material. That our criteria were basically right. What a number of people in the committee, though, weren't in favor of, weren't happy about, though, is that some of the material that we were not making open access is public domain, and we want to avoid putting the public domain stuff back behind the paywall, even if it's to preserve the value of the CRL membership. That we have to avoid doing that. And so I think my thought is we should go ahead on that basis. I think the balance of what we have available is we have more material available in open access than we have material available just for members only. But I think that balance is going to change as we do more digitization on demand, because what people are using is material post-1945 for the most part. most area studies research that deals with material that's post-World War II. And so that's something we have a lot of. So we would be putting more material, making more material available only just to people at your institutions. But what do you think? Thoughts on that? Sarah?
Thanks, Bernie. When you sent this around in email, I had a discussion about the strategic questions with some of our folks in the library, and especially this one. You know, we really thought it was a very good question to open up for discussion, and we sort of came to the conclusion that the collective community, the membership of CRL, has this enormous wealth of resources, and it is in fact our goal as a community of libraries to increase access to scholarship. And the free rider problem is really not so much a problem, but a time sequencing. That is, the value we gain is being the early deciders and the strategic lead in deciding what's going to get digitized, and then being able to very readily, you know, get first access to it. And if then, as it goes out into the world, more people are gaining access, that does not detract from the reason we invested in it in the first place, which was to help shape the agenda and to help speed access upstream, if you will. So we sort of feel the answer to this is yes, if they can be open, and that we shouldn't worry that there is some sort of damage from a free rider problem, because we are already gaining the value by helping shape the agenda and speed the initial availability.
How do people feel about that? I'm glad people read my emails, by the way.
So, yes, speaking for when we had a discussion among the CSPC, feeling that it was something we did want to encourage, get explored, and I did notice, interestingly, that just earlier this week there was a offer or a message that went out regarding CRLs and putting out the Reveal Digital Independent Voices.
Yeah.
And that's like a model, I think, that's worth exploring there as well, because it does provide that opportunity to be in the first circle of thinking about making decisions about materials, and then having that sort of privileged access, but ultimately it becomes open source as well.
Well, the Reveal, before we get to our next, the gentleman's going to talk. Reveal is a good model. I mean, if for those of you who aren't familiar with Reveal Digital, they came up with a plan to digitize a lot of alternative newspapers and alternative publications from the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and they collected money from various institutions to finance that. And the idea was, once they collected all the money, they did the whole collection, then it would become open access. The problem with though is they're in deep financial trouble now. I mean, that collection may never see the light of day, or the whole collection may never see the light of day. They have a huge shortfall of funds, and part of the reason is because there are libraries, certain libraries have told Reveal, if you're going to make it open access anyway, why should I pay you $15,000, $20,000 up front? So, there are both sides of it, but I think, I like the idea of we're the people that, the scholars at your institutions are the scholars that are deciding what gets digitized through CRL. So that's a benefit in itself. And so even if after it gets digitized, it's available to everybody, then that's, that's still there's still some privileging of CRL libraries. There's a question here, the man with the microphone.
I guess just driving in today, listening to NPR, they're going through a pledge drive, I guess. The analogy isn't perfect at all by any means, but to a certain extent, we know that there's a free rider problem with public broadcasting,
Yeah.
but there's a core that supports it, that seems to be able to support it. There seems to be a certain amount of free rider, but there seems to be a certain amount that then transitions over into becoming paying members. They do provide some kind of benefits for if you're a paying member that you don't get if you just listen and watch the broadcasting. And I don't know if that provides any kind of a model that applies here, but I like the idea that providing an analogy for us being kind of the leaders of providing something that will become available generally, that it attracts more, it may help attract more paying members just by becoming more, it becoming more known through the community, community scholarship.
So that should be part of the CRL message, that this is what CRL does, essentially, to the larger world. And you think that would create the incentives for more institutions to co-invest?
I think there should be thinking about ways of offering. See if there's ways of offering some benefits, some added value to people who invest beyond the things that are freely accessible. And when they see the value of becoming members, then after they've sample some of the things that are free, so to speak.
Beyond the tote bag, the free tote bag, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not sure exactly
Trip to Mexico.
what to suggest, but that's kind of the concept.
Yeah, no, it's a very good analogy. I like that. Thank you. Scott Walter from.
I just like to I'd build on that by saying I think the logic in making some portion of the content open access drives from the philosophical commitments that many of us have in bending towards openness. And then the teaser effect, if you will, the two-level effect that was just suggested, that you would see some measure of benefit openly, but of course be introduced to the fact that there is much greater access, because it will be long past my professional lifetime that we would be talking about the vast majority of this content being digitized and available. So I think you've got those two tiers. The other possibility, I think, is sort of the teaser effect. If we were strategic, and this gets, I think, to Sarah's point about the benefit of having the opportunity to shape decisions. If we were strategic in the content that was digitized and made openly available with an eye toward its use, knowing that there were scholars who were going to make use of it in their teaching and their research, you would begin to see evidence that, well, this is what's openly available and how it's being used, and now imagine what you could do if, as a full member, you had access to the broader range of material. And I think, again, it's easier to get people to buy in and see what the benefit of membership might be if they're able to get in and work with some of the content.
So if say, faculty at institutions that are not CRL libraries are discovering CRL content, and they know, oh, this is only the tip of the iceberg, then that how we generate those digital things, that makes sense. Yeah, okay. Good.
Hi, Bernie. I'd also suggest maybe the added value in the sort of freemium model is not just about the content itself, but also about tools and access. So you think about things that are HOTI and then access to the HTRC. Or you think about ways that content can be packaged differently for local use, that can be discoverable differently, and then I think we would be very supportive of as much as possible being openly accessible, but maybe we build to say, to be a member, you get more functionality, not just more content.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, the added functionality, though, can be a big cost or a challenge. When we first started digitizing things in the collections, we were doing it in response to the request. Somebody wanted to use a reel of microfilm, or somebody wanted to use a volume of a serial, a rare serial, that kind of thing, and we digitized. We were trying there how we digitized was pretty simple. I mean, it's just basically, create a big TIFF image and then generate PDFs that people can use. And what we were really trying to do is kind of replicate that great experience of microfilm, that all the visual splendor of microform in digital form. And that's also a hedge against copyright infringement, because we know if we put something up in minimally functional form, it's going to be less likely to infringe somebody's, or step on somebody's business model than if we put it up in full text or full functionality and that kind of thing. And so we still, what we digitize and we put up there is still pretty rudimentary, but I think, maybe there are ways where we could, there would be appropriate tools that could be layered on that thought. Sarah?
The on-demand digitizing, when you were giving the statistics earlier, like 17,000 pages for Hong Kong University. So if a member has on-demand digitizing request, is that included? I mean, I should know this, but are we paying extra for that, or is that included in our membership fee?
No, that's all free.
So right away.
That's why we're in the hole.
That's the immediate advantage to being a member, is especially for smaller places that don't have the facilities. There's your on-demand digitizing that links directly to what your faculty need, and that's an enormous advantage that then is not being gained by the people later just looking at it open access.
Yeah, no, that's true. Your faculty are driving our digitization program for the most part. Yeah. Faculty love it too. The comments we get back when we post these things up from the users are, people are over the moon. You'd never know. Yes.
Hi, Carla Street.
Carla.
I guess I'm a dissenting member of the committee. I think another important point about member benefit and IP access is we see all the time that even when we are members, our users are not always able to navigate our authentication systems appropriately.
Not really.
And so, inevitably, when we create barriers to keep other people out, we end up keeping out some of our own users in some of their own uses.
That's
Yes,
interesting.
They want to authenticate from home. We tell them how to do that all the time, but they don't always manage to make it work. Or by the time they've gone through that, they don't care anymore. And we've missed out the opportunity to see it too. So I think in some ways, even there's always a cost, even to us as members, of building that wall
So
for everyone else.
You're saying authentication is getting in the way of people finding things?
For some percentage,
accessing
even
things.
our own users.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Will run into, problems
Yeah.
because of that. And then we have our own users who want to download things and data mine them. Again, authentication
Yeah.
can slow down some of that.
Good, thank you. All right, good points. I think we have resolved this. I think we're leaning, the community is definitely leaning towards open access and to as a way to expose more to even the Philistines out there that are not yet members of the CRL community. So, thank you. Question number 3 is kind of a trick question. We are starting to digitize historical serials held by both CRL and by Linda Hall Library. We've identified a number of serials on the theme of infrastructural, history of infrastructure. As our infrastructure in the real world continues to crumble, we are looking more at the historical literature of infrastructure. So there are a number of titles, I think about a dozen or so in the Linda Hall Library that CRL has partial holdings for. We are starting to digitize those and bring these partial holdings together. We would like to have a complete holding of those titles at Linda Hall Library. Linda Hall Library, we created that partnership with them because they are superb, well curated, well protected, and heavily monitored independent research library. And we would like our parts of these serials to go there rather than their parts of them to go to CRL, because number one, they're doing the digitization, they're doing the scanning. But number two, we think that bringing them together there would make them more whole and more accessible. We will have high resolution digital scans or digital copies of these that will be available to member institutions and institutions via the web. And so the problem won't be accessed. The physical collections actually here will be retired from interlibrary loan use. We would rather not send them through UPS to people request them anymore. So the access will be through the digital scans. Linda Hall Library will be obligated to maintain these collections, these materials, for the long term. And should they at any time in the future decide not to continue to maintain them, then they would have to offer them back to CRL. So it sounds like, to me, I hope it sounds like to you like a no-brainer, but we have to, the CRL collections, what we do with CRL collections is up to you, the members. So we're going to be holding a referendum on this question. We're going to be formally polling the membership by email or by some electronic means within the next month or so. But I wanted to float the idea here because I think that this is a different track for CRL. This is something that we haven't done before. I know CRL far back in the mists of our early history did dispose of certain materials, but the whole purpose of CRL is so that you can rely on these materials to not disappear. And so in many cases, the materials we have are the only copies of things. And so I think it's important that everyone have an understanding of what we're talking about here. I think the relationship with Linda Hall has been a good one for CRL. Obviously it's served in terms of use. Many of our institutions are getting a huge amount of document delivery from Linda Hall for free. Moving into digitization of the historical collections is, I think, even going to generate more benefits. So it's been a good thing. I'd like to see more of this kind of thing done. I would like to see merging of whole runs of titles at Linda Hall if we can make them available electronically to the members. But I would get a sense of what people's take is on this.
So just a quick question, does merging imply necessarily transferring ownership?
The ownership would be transferred to Linda Hall with the provision that they would have to offer them back to CRL if they decide to take them out of service, essentially. Yeah. Yes?
Given all the things that CRL wants to do with its money, what's the cost of this?
James, you could probably look at that.
Hi, this is James. There's sort of, a per page cost, and then there's the less quantifiable staff costs, of course, that go with this. We could quantify them, but I don't have them immediately at my fingertips. Generally speaking, we're starting off small in this endeavor as we work through the potential workflow, the potential benefits to the members. Generally speaking, this would be something to the tune of about 25 cents a page for digitization. Our initial foray was about 100,000 pages. So the cost in our pilot looking at this is fairly low. It's
You do the math.
$15,000 or so.
Oh, how much?
Less than $15,000 for that digitization cost. Adding on that the staff costs for paging materials, the shipping costs to Linda Hall, and the Linda Hall costs that might be attendant to that are, generally speaking, they're not all that much. If we scale this up, however, we would need to look at ways to make it more efficient. At this point, Linda Hall is committed to digitizing using its own staff and its own capacity, where they are making high-resolution preservation quality TIFFs for the material and delivering derivative copies to CRL for access through our own server. If we wanted to do that in the scale of millions of pages, we would need to revisit that workflow. Using an outsourced vendor would be my best guess for that.
Well, the digitization cost would be there. The digitization cost would be there no matter where the physical stuff is. I was really wondering about the cost of moving the materials physically.
Generally speaking, we need to look at the benefits of how much overlap of any particular title is there. Is it to CRL's advantage to move more things off of our shelf and make space in our collection for additional collections to come in, which would argue we're filling bigger gaps in Linda Hall's collection. It's cheaper for CRL, however, to fill in smaller slices where we're just pulling a volume or two to fill in their gaps and creating a whole collection. So we're balancing the two types of goals in this. You know, is the goal to save space at CRL and create a digital collection? Or is the goal to maximize the amount of content at minimal cost to CRL? I think we've started on the latter of the two, which is by pulling just a few volumes off of our shelf, we can get a whole lot more digitized, you know, without having to have students page the material and creating the Swiss cheese effect in our collections. So I don't know if that answers your questions. The shipping costs, we have, you know, discounted shipping through UPS ground that we send materials. So it's not without its cost, a few $1,000s perhaps a year in the shipping at this point. But again, if we start moving entire bays, and if some of the board members just took a tour of CRL and we showed them miles of cereal shelving that we have, if we really started doing large scale shipping, then it would be fairly expensive.
So it's relatively small in comparison to our overall shipping bill during the course of the year. Yeah. Remember, we're taking this one step at a time. The referendum will be just to cover this project that we're doing with the Linda Hall Library. But we think it's important to air it because we think it's important that you know what, you know, you have a say in what we do with the collections, because these are the combined assets that have been developed over the years by your institutions. So. All right. Let's go back to the bricks and mortar CRL. This is the Google Maps view of the little thumbtack there is that 6050 South Kenwood Avenue, which is the CRL building. It's a big bricks and mortar reality. It's a building that was built, the first module was built in the 1980s, second module was built in the 1990s. It's 100 and some thousand square feet, about 160 some thousand square feet. It's about 5 million volumes and volume equivalents. It's not full. We have a fair amount of space, not huge amounts of space, but a fair amount of space, but we have to allot that very carefully. Last year or the year before, we took in UCLA, a large collection of newspapers, foreign newspapers from UCLA, and those consume some space. But I think to a large extent, well, a lot of what we've been acquiring has been microform, which doesn't take up a lot of space. So this is a big part of the operations. It's a big fixed cost for CRL. Just the building itself is about just a little over $1 million a year to maintain. If you talk about the operations in the building as well, our budget is just a little under $7 million, and their treasurer will talk about that just in a few minutes. But I'm showing you the photo because you know, this is an important reality about CRL. CRL is not a professional association. It's not like ARL or CARL. It's an organization that has big bricks and mortar, big capital assets. And it's an organization that has been built over the course of years by the members, not just the money that the members have provided, but the expertise that has come from members of your staff participating in the Area Materials Project and the Global Resources Project, those kinds of things. So I wanted to give you a sense of your property here, that you remember that when you leave, remember that you all own a little bit of real estate in Chicago. So that's a reality. We do it has been, you know, again, we're about 51 people that work at CRL, plus student help that comes and goes. And those people are doing what people at CRL have always done, except about 30% more of it, not in terms of volume, but in terms of the nature of what we do. We're doing collection analysis, we're doing licensing, we're doing digitization, and those are things that CRL wasn't doing 15 years ago. And so we owe a great debt to the staff and the people that have been working, like many people in your staff, very, very hard over the years. And I just wanted to say that to acknowledge them. I wanted to thank our board as well, who have exercised, particularly the outgoing board members, Susan Gibbons, the other is Susan Martin, still here from University of Tennessee. Susan Martin may have gone, and James Grossman from American Historical Association. They all took on membership in CRL's board, and they kept at it for 6 years. Susan Gibbons and Jim Grossman both assumed service on the board at times of transition in their careers. Susan had just become Dean of Libraries at Yale University. We didn't know that when we invited her, but we kind of lucked out to get another Ivy on the board. And Jim Grossman had just been appointed the executive director of American Historical Association. So for them coming on the board in those times was a challenge. And so I know they both burned a lot of extra midnight oil on CRL's behalf. So most of all, I want to thank you, though, because it's been your participation, the participation of your staff, the expertise, knowledge, and skill, and dedication and commitment of your staff to the integrity of documentation and evidence that's made CRL what it is today.